Those poor children working under inhumane conditions to mine cobalt for your electric car. But electric cars actually emit more CO2 than gasoline or diesel cars if you take into account the battery production. The lithium in lithium-ion batteries in electric cars has to be harvested in the desert using gigantic amounts of water, and the whole landscape in the desert is completely destroyed. The electric grid will collapse because it simply cannot support so many electric cars. There's simply not enough electricity to support millions of electric cars on the roads. Where should all the electricity come from, huh?
Who hasn't heard these or similar arguments against electric cars? You can hear these arguments when you tell your co-worker that you have bought an electric car. You can hear these arguments when you tell your friends that you own an electric car or that you are thinking to buy one. You can even read these arguments in our good old quality news media, who is always very objective and never biased in any way. But what truth is there to these so-called arguments? Can they withstand a thorough scientific analysis? Let's take a closer look at each of the anti-electric car arguments and examine them carefully, one by one.
But what about all those children working under inhumane conditions to mine cobalt for your electric car? Don't you have any conscience, you monster? Then you stare at this person in disbelief and you don't exactly know what to reply. But restrain yourself, fellow electric companion. Let's take a deep breath and think about this rationally. Let us take a closer look at this argument. First of all, rare earth metals such as cobalt is only needed in the cathode of the battery. And typically it only makes up 20% of the cathode material. And newer cathodes need even less cobalt. They typically consist of 80% nickel, 10% manganese and only 10% cobalt. Second, there are only hardly any mines where cobalt is mined on its own. Cobalt is typically a byproduct of copper or nickel harvesting. And this is how a typical cobalt, nickel and copper mine looks like.
So the thing with child labor might be a little bit exaggerated. Nonetheless, the cobalt percentage of lithium-ion batteries will continue declining more and more. It's also noteworthy that cobalt has been mined for the last decades and is needed for applications in many different industries such as the aviation industry and the military industry. But strangely, no one has ever said anything about the immorality of cobalt mining before. Only now that EVs are coming, cobalt suddenly seems to be a huge problem. It's completely blown out of proportion, as we could see.
Okay, you win this one. But what about the lithium, huh? What about the lithium? I read it's harvested in the desert, needlessly wasting huge amounts of water and completely destroying the desert landscape.
Really? First of all, it's again funny that no one cared about lithium mining before EVs came along. Because lithium is also needed for glass, porcelain, even smearing oil, and dozens of other industry applications. But okay, let's take a look at a typical lithium mine in the Atacama Desert. So basically, you dissolve some desert soil in water and then return the sand back to the desert. Separating the salts from lithium has a low environmental impact. The water, by the way, is also not wasted, because you might have heard that there is a water cycle on this planet. Water that evaporates will sooner or later come down as rain again. Water cannot vanish into thin air. This is called the conservation of mass. You know, physics and shit. Also, nothing grows in the Atacama Desert. It's a dead place, so no one would live there anyways. Plus, as Marco Octavio Rivera of Bolivia's Environmental Defense League says, lithium mining, as observed in countries with deposits like Chile, Argentina, and China, seems to be less hazardous than other kinds of mineral extraction. Lithium could be one of the least contaminating mining processes. And what type of harvesting is, by the way, much more damaging to the environment? That's right, dear petrolheads. F***ing coal! Take a look at how the landscape looks after coal has been mined. Not too nice, does it? and this is not in the desert. Plus, coal then goes on to emit CO2, adding even more hazard to the environment.
Okay, good. You've won the battle, but not the war. Because electric cars actually emit at least as much, if not more CO2 than diesel or gasoline cars. You have just shifted the tailpipe away to the electricity power plant. Now I have you. Well, of course we have to take into account the energy mix of the electricity in the country in which the electric vehicle is used. The energy mix in India, for example, is of course much more CO2 emitting than in the US or Europe. But as an example calculation, let's just take the energy mix of the United States and the Tesla Model 3 as an electric vehicle. So that was the energy mix of the United States in 2017. We see that only 11% is renewable energies, 9% nuclear power, 14% coal, 29% natural gas, and 37% from petroleum. So we want to calculate how much CO2 is emitted per kilowatt hour of energy created in the United States. So we then get 707 grams of CO2 emitted per kilowatt hour of energy as an average for the United States in 2017. Okay, let's take our Tesla Model 3 performance, for example. We normally have a energy consumption of 150 to 180 watt hours per kilometer, or 0.15 to 0.18 kilowatt hours per kilometer. So our Tesla Model 3 performance would on average only emit 106 to 127 grams per kilometer in the United States. Now this number is comparable to the most efficient diesel cars on the market and 30 to 40% lower than an average gasoline car. And this is for the standard US energy mix. As soon as we have more renewable energy in the mix, this number goes down insanely low. If we now make the same calculation for the energy mix of California, our Model 3 will only emit 48 to 57 grams of CO2 per kilometer. And if you live in a state like, for example, Vermont, which gets like almost all of its energy from renewable energy sources, this number goes basically down to 0 grams of CO2 emitted per kilometer. So as soon as you happen to live in a state with more renewable energies in the mix, no gasoline or diesel car can ever compete with an electric vehicle anymore.
But wait, what about the battery? There are huge CO2 emissions when fabricating the battery of an EV.
So you think that by taking into account the battery production for electric cars, suddenly electric cars emit more CO2 than your beautiful diesel or gasoline car? Really? Well, of course we want to be fair, so I'm very sure that you have also taken into account that your oil has to be pumped out of the earth on oil rigs, which of course costs huge amounts of energy and also emits CO2. Then you might have heard that there are ships that carry the oil to land, huge ships, tankers, oil tankers. They, by the way, also emit CO2, yes. But it's not over yet, because then the oil arrives at refineries and they need electricity too to refine the oil, So that electricity also emits CO2. But then the process of refining the oil also emits CO2, even more CO2. Isn't that cool? But it's not over yet, because the diesel or gasoline fuel has to be transported from the refinery in huge trucks to the fuel stations, of course, which also emit CO2 again. I'm sorry for that outburst, but you can find a good calculation for the entire process, the so-called well-to-wheel ratio, calculating all the steps in between from the oil rig to stepping on your gas pedal in your gasoline or diesel car, and then comparing this to all the steps for electric vehicles. You can find it in the paper in Science Direct, published in 2018. For interested viewers, we have put the link into the description. You can go through the calculations yourself if you want, but the end result is, long story short and no big surprise, electric vehicles totally obliterate gasoline or diesel cars. And we can see that for every different class of vehicle, be it a subcompact, compact, full-size luxury, MPV or SUV, in any case, an electric vehicle always emits far less CO2 over the complete cycle than a comparable diesel or gasoline car. But of course, different energy mixes were also taken into account from different countries. So you might say, okay, in the US or in Europe, an electric vehicle might emit less CO2. But what about a country like China or India, where there's a lot of fossil fuels in the mix and almost no renewable energies? Then an EV is certainly far worse than a diesel or gasoline car, right? We can read in the paper, regarding battery electric vehicles in countries with high ratio of nuclear or renewable energy in their generation mix, battery electric vehicles are significantly more environmentally friendly than internal combustion engine vehicles. On the other hand, in countries with elevated ratio of fossil fuels and especially coal and oil, battery electric vehicles emit marginally less CO2 than internal combustion engine vehicles. So in other words, even in the worst case scenario, in countries where there's almost no renewable energies in the mix, like only fossil fuels, electric cars still emit less CO2 over their whole production and life cycle than a comparable gasoline or diesel car. Okay, you win. But what about the electric grid? It will certainly collapse if too many electric cars go online. Because there's not enough electricity to support all those electric cars, huh? The grid will certainly collapse if they go online.
Well, of course not! In 2018 alone, the 263 million passenger cars in the US, plus all trucks and buses, consumed a staggering 142.86 billion gallons of gasoline. The energy density of 1 gallon of gasoline is 33.4 kilowatt hours. So we would get a total of 4.77 times 10 to the 12 kilowatt hours. That's equal to 4,771 terawatt hours. Now, what many people forget is that the energy efficiency of an electric motor is at least 4 times higher than a typical gasoline motor. A gasoline motor only has an average energy efficiency of 20%. 80% is wasted as heat, so most people are basically driving a mobile heater. On the other hand, an electric motor has on average a 90% energy efficiency. Let's make it 80% to be more conservative. Therefore, we would get 1,193 terawatt hours of additional energy needed per year in the US. That's only an increase of 25%. That's surprisingly low. Only 25% more electricity needed if all cars, buses, and trucks in the US were suddenly EVs. That could be covered only with renewable energies that grow very fast within the next 2 decades. So let's recap our findings. First, only 10% of a battery is cobalt, which mostly is mined in nickel and copper mines, only a tiny fraction of it being mined under bad circumstances. And this percentage is dropping very fast.
Second, the lithium is mined in the desert, which is uninhabited anyway, and it is found to be the least contaminating harvesting process of all the harvesting processes.
Third, even with the current energy mix, EVs only emit as much CO2 as the most efficient diesels. But as soon as more renewable energy is coming into the mix, as for example in California, EVs totally obliterate gasoline or diesel cars. Only 48 to 57 grams CO2 per kilometer in California and 0 grams in Vermont. Number 4, taking into account all production steps for gasoline and diesel cars, including the refining and transport of oil, and all production steps for EVs, including the battery production.
We find that electric vehicles are, in any scenario, in any country, more environmentally friendly than comparable diesel or gasoline cars. 5. The energy grid would not even collapse in the extreme scenario that all buses, trucks and cars on the road today in the United States would be by some magic instantly converted to electric vehicles, because this would only require 25% more electricity than is being generated now. And these 25% more can be easily covered 100% with renewable energies in the next 2 decades.
So, if you're an anti-EV person, next time comes along with the so-called arguments against electric vehicles, you can verbally destroy that person with the arguments we gave you.
Well, this episode was a bit longer and more detailed and had a few more calculations in them, but it was important for us to fight all these anti-EV fake news. But we hope you still enjoyed this episode nonetheless.
And if you're new to this channel, be sure to subscribe, because in the future we will upload many more videos just like this one, focusing not only on electric cars, but also other interesting technological developments such as manned spaceflight.
There's a storm outside, sorry that it's so loud, but there's a freaking storm outside, a tornado or something. Wow. So don't forget to share this video with your friends and of course also your petrolhead friends, so that they also might learn something about all those anti-EV fake news going on. Ciao!
See you next time!